In the earlier recordings, we focused primarily on one-dimensional arrays. We think of a one-dimensional array as a row with cells or elements. For example, pizza toppings, reindeer names. We're dealing with one piece of information, one discrete piece of information per cell, and we think of it sort of in a linear fashion. We can also do two-dimensional arrays in Java. Now, I'm not talking about array lists here. I'm still only talking about arrays. But the complexity increases as we add that second dimension, particularly when we start using for loops to go through the elements in a two-dimensional array. But we're going to start out by talking about how to declare a two-dimensional array and how to figure out the total count or the total number of elements in a two-dimensional array. With the one-dimensional array, it was very simple. We just used the array name .length, and that gave us the total count, the total number of cells or elements that were in that array. We're going to see that that's a little trickier when we're dealing with a 2D array. So when we think of a two-dimensional array, we can think of a tic-tac-toe board or a checkerboard or a spreadsheet, something that has both rows and columns in it. So if I had a spreadsheet that I was using to track club membership for, say, a robotics club, and I had names and grades for each individual in the club, I've got one column for names, I have a second column for grades, and each row has both the name and the grade of an individual student in it. So now I have not only rows, but I also have columns. I have rows indicating, for example, all of one person's information, and then columns will give me either the names or the grades, okay? So when I want to set up a two-dimensional array in Java to hold this information, I'm going to add an extra set of brackets. Whereas with the one-dimensional array, I just have the one set. Now, because it's two dimensions, I'm going to have two sets of brackets. And I can do just like I did with the one-dimensional array. I can have a 2D array of ints or strings or booleans or doubles. I'm going to use a string example here. But I can declare it using one line, and I can allocate the memory using a second line, or just like with the one-dimensional, I can do it all in one line. So here the primary difference is the second set of brackets. Now when you set up a two-dimensional array, you can use a variable name here, or you can hard code the values like I've done with the 3 and the 2. This first dimension is always the total number of rows. So you can see here that I have 3 rows. Jack, Jane, and Adam each have a row. The second dimension is always the total number of columns. You can see that I have 2 columns, one for name and one for grade. So if I wanted to know how many total items were in this array, I'm not talking total rows, I'm talking total pieces of information, meaning Jack 12, Jane 11, Adam 10. If I were putting this in a spreadsheet, how many cells would I be using? I would be using 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I have 6 pieces of information. So we can see if we multiply 3 times 2, that gives us 6. That's our total count of items that we have in the array. Now, with a one-dimensional array, I spent a lot of time talking about how you could use the array name .length to get the total count. If you do that here, if you do member info.length, that is valid, you can do that. That is only going to give you the number of rows, which in this case is 3. So you're not going to get back 6 out of that. You're going to get back the number of rows. Okay? So keep that in mind. It doesn't, the length does not suddenly give you 6 back just because it's a two-dimensional array. And so what some people will do when they're trying to figure out the size of a two-dimensional array in the code, they'll set up a variable, so they don't get confused, they'll set up a variable called rows, and they'll use the standard length. Now to get the number of columns, this is what you have to do. You have to actually indicate the index number of a row in order to get the columns back. So if I wanted to figure out that there are 2 columns in this thing, I could do member info. Remember, we start counting with 0, so this is row 0. So go to the 0 row and give me back the length. Well, that's going to give me back the number of columns. Now, the trick with that is, occasionally, although I don't think I've ever seen this on an AP exam, occasionally you'll have some weird situation where you don't have the same number of columns in each row. Again, I cannot think of when that ever happens. I've never seen that. But for those of you who are at an advanced programming level, you would probably naturally start thinking, well, what if for some reason the array were set up so that it didn't have the same number of columns per row? This would not quite necessarily give you the correct answer. But for those of you who are beginners, for those of you who are not at the advanced programming level, just go with this idea that you can take the first row. In theory, if every row has the same number of columns, in theory you could use any row number, but I always use the first one. You can take that first row, that index number, put it there with dot length, and for purposes of this class, you will get back the correct number of columns, because I'm not going to give you any type of an exercise where there's anything odd. So for purposes of this class, you can assume that you can go to that first row just like this and say dot length, and you will get back the correct number of columns. So this would give me back a 3, this would give me back a 2, and then if I needed to know the total items in the 2D array, I could do rows times columns, and that would print out my 6. So that is the only way that I know to get back in an array the actual total number of elements in the array. And you may see something referencing that on the exam. So know that this will bring back rows, this will bring back columns. And for those of you who are advanced programmers, you can play around with some arrays where you try to fake it out with not having the same number of columns for each row, and experiment with that and see what you get back. But for everyone else, this is all that you have to worry about right here. Now, the other thing that you need to keep in mind is this first number will always be the total number of rows. The second number will always be the total number of columns. So if you remember RC cola, row column. This is always the number of rows, this is always the number of columns. You can't reverse that, you can't flip that around. You can't say, well, the compiler will figure out I typed the 2 first and the 3 second. The compiler will figure that out. No, it won't either. And you'll have all kinds of problems. So you have to remember that. They go in that order, and they must be in that order every time, row, column. So now we've got the idea of rows and columns. setting up either in 2 lines or in 1 line the array, allocating the memory. We've got the idea that we can get the number of rows using the length, and then if we tell it to go to the first row in effect, we can get the length from that. That is technically the number of columns. I know that's confusing. That's just something you kind of have to remember. And then if we know the number of rows and columns, we can multiply them together to get back the total number of items in the array. Now, just like before, we're going to start counting with 0. This is row 0. The second row is row 1. The third row is row 2. Now when we deal with columns, this is column 0 and this is column 1. So if I asked you the coordinates of Jack, if I wanted to print out Jack's name, I would have to go to column 0, row 0. That would print out Jack. If I asked you to write the coordinates for Adam, you would tell me Adam is in row 2, column 0. That's Adam. If I asked you for Jane's coordinates for the name Jane, you would tell me row 1, column 0, and that would print out Jane if I had these in print lines, okay? So row, column, to print all of those out. If I asked you to print out what grade Jack was in a print line, oh, I'm using string here. I should be using the array name, member info. Now I want to print out what grade Jack is in. That is in row 0, column 1. That's going to print out 12. Now I want to print out what grade Adam is in. That is in row 2, column 1, and that would print out my 10. Now I want to print out the grade that Jane is in. She is in, her grade is in row 1, column 1. Okay? So you really start having to, it's like you're playing Battleship, you know? You have to think about this row, that column, and the intersection of those two gives you the information back that you want. Now, if I wanted to write a for loop that would give me all of Jack's information first, his name and 12, and then I would have it print out all of Jane's information, Jane 11, and then I would have it print out all of Adam's information, Adam 10. If I wanted to print out by row, I need to use, and this is where it gets tricky, I have to use 2 sets of for loops. And I think I'll save that for the next recording. But I'm going to have to use nested for loops. I'm going to use 2 for loops when I want to walk the rows or the columns. And that's where it gets a little tricky, and we'll talk about that more next time.